Welcome back to Big Asian Energy. Today, I have with us the author, and I'm someone I'm very excited by because I'm going through her book right now, and it's an incredible book. The author of Patterns That Remain, a guide to healing for Asian children of immigrants. I have author, therapist, overall, I would say Asian diaspora leader inspiration, Stacey Diane Litam. I hope I got that name pronunciation this time around. Hi, so happy to have
Hi.
you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so we were just jamming a couple of seconds ago about the background of your name, which I actually think is so important. Can you just give us a little background on where your name comes from?
Absolutely. My last name, Lee Tom, was originally many years ago actually Tom Lee. And when the ancestors immigrated from Hong Kong to the Philippines, they had the opportunity to change their last name, like many of us do when we move to a new location.
Mhm.
So, to prevent the discrimination of their progeny, they actually transposed their name from Tom Lee to Lee Tom. Around this time, there was a lot of discrimination around obviously Chinese sounding names. And a lot of discrimination was really portrayed through paperwork. Folks were
Mm.
screening immigration papers, green card applications. And so if folks had an obviously Chinese sounding name, the fear was that the application would be discarded or thrown out. So
Wow.
Lee is ethnically ambiguous and it is that way by design.
Wow. That's so interesting because I think that we're probably not the only people who've ever, for me personally, there was a time where I wanted to change my last name because I didn't love how quote unquote ethnic it was. So my last name is Wang. And growing up as a teenager in North America, Wang has a couple of meanings in slang. And I got every possible joke related to every possible dick joke you can imagine I got growing up. So there was actually a time where I wanted to change my last name to something like Young, Young, because there's a westernized version of that and an Asian version of that. Man, I just want to say I can relate. Although I think that your ancestors probably dealt with much, much worse during that time.
I appreciate that disclosure too about sort of the ways in which Asian men, when it comes to the intersection of ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, you face some really distinct challenges. We see the psychological, emotional castration of Asian men, the presumptions about body and genital size, and also the ability to be a lover. This goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's a long history of discrimination toward Asian men that's been perpetuated across time immemorial.
Oh yeah, for sure. It was a rough time. There's a lot of history for us to dive in there. But before we dive into those specifics, I just want to start with this book because first and foremost, I'm really excited about it. Just flipping through some of the chapters in the last few weeks has been eye-opening in a lot of ways. You talk about different healing orientation models. You talk about the patterns, you talk about scarcity mindset, you talk about this idea of this conspiracy of silence that comes up. There is some really powerful and I would say even tangible parts. But I'm curious, in your view, having written this whole book, how would you define this book?
Oh, so the way that I talk about this book is very much like this book is a love letter. This book is a love letter to my younger self who grew up in the predominantly white Midwest. It's a
Mm,
love to Asian Americans, many of us who had to navigate feelings of otherness and feeling like we weren't good enough, feeling like we
mm,
had to learn how to position ourselves in ways that allowed us to exist separately from the social capital that our parents were leveraging from us. It's also a love letter to just people who have struggled with insecure attachment wounds, who have struggled with patterns of intergenerational trauma, and
mhm.
folks who are told to work twice as hard to get half as far.
Wow, there's a lot of depth there. I just want to start personally from your story because you said that this, in part, was from your own journey. So can you give us a little background? Who is Stacy and how did you come to write this book?
Yeah. So there's two stories that I share when I think about the origin story of this book. This book really started as a reflection because of my partner. So folks will often say, how do I manage to do all the things that I do? And I always say the ultimate cheat code is my husband. I married an incredible partner who says, go do the things that bring your heart joy. Go do the things that make you happy. And so I have this secure base that lets me truly go to DC and speak for a day or fly out to LA for a weekend and do all these exciting things that I want to do. And I know that when I come back home, he's got me. That's really special. And I didn't even realize how special it was until one particular night. And this is actually in the book. I had a really long day, John. I saw clients all day and then I taught my class in the evening. And when I got home, I was every man's idea of the perfect partner. I was hungry, I was fussy, I was not particularly nice. And I came home, I walk in, he's like, "How's your day?" And I gave him one of these. He's poor man. It's like, I'm just gonna
That
go back
one
and watch
landed
my
in my soul.
like wife of the year.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just gonna go back and watch my sports ball game.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm thinking, okay, like what's the fastest thing that I can get in my belly that's delicious that I can just eat real quick? And I find this pack of ramen
Okay.
and poach some eggs and I make this cute little meal for myself. And as I'm walking to the couch after being a monster to my poor partner, he
Mhm.
picks up the remote and he says, "Hey babe, what do you want to watch on TV? Because I know that you like to watch cooking shows when you eat." And there was this moment where I felt so seen and I felt so unconditionally accepted and loved and held, even the
Mm.
messy parts of me. And that felt really neat, John, because coming from an Asian family, I only knew love to be existing within the context of transaction and reciprocity. To America, so the least you can do is get straight A's. I
Mhm.
made a sacrifice for you, so the least you could do is take me to the airport. Yeah, of just being accepted. Even the messy parts of me for who I am felt so inherently healing. And so that's what led me to write this book is I wanted to know what is it about our experience as Asian children of immigrants that lead us to have these really beautiful secure attachments in ways that look different than the relationships that we were raised to understand looked like love.
Okay, first and foremost, can I just start a fan club for your partner? Because bravo! Like,
You
that
love
is are they also writing a relationship book that we can download?
it. He is, I'm telling you, Matt is the ultimate cheat code. He's just the
Oh.
best.
But what you brought up is so true, though. Growing up, I grew up in an Asian family. I have a pair of Asian parents. "I love you" was just not something we heard in the household.
Yeah.
Physical affection, getting hugs was it wasn't, like, absent. It wasn't like my parents are cold, but I think love just looked different.
Yeah.
And I always reflected on that. I remember when I was going through on my own therapy journey, there was one time where I realized, like, how important it was to me to say "I love you" to my parents, even if they didn't say it back. And now my mom will actually say it back, but, like, for a while, I would sit there and I would be like, "Hey, mom, thank you. I love you." And then my mom would give me one of those and then change the subject, or my dad would just be like, yeah, like, he'll smile, but he'll change the subject, and I'll sit there and I won't relent. I'll be like, "I love you." And now my mom will actually say, "I love you" back. I haven't gotten my dad to do it yet, but I'll do it soon. So, this is a really good point. Like, love as a stated thing, like, it isn't as common, but does it take away from the impact? And how does it impact us?
So this is such a good question, John. Like we are getting into the meat right
Oh,
away. I'm
let's do it.
so excited. So we think about our immigrant parents, our Asian parents. Many of them gave up their entire life to come to this country to give us opportunity to flee from genocide, to be safe from political discrimination. And so we have to contextualize the true trauma and the challenges of assimilation our immigrant parents faced coming to America. To do that, they had to focus on survival. The
Mhm.
nature of existing in America in an entirely new country that's so different from their own, if they didn't focus on survival, they would become too overwhelmed to be able to keep a roof over our heads, to keep food on the table. And so, because they didn't get that practice in cultivating mental health literacy or even the language around emotional well being, they weren't able to hold space for us when we grew up and wanted to have conversations around feelings or sadness or anxiety. So, the
Hmm.
best our parents know to show care is through action. I can count on 4 fingers the amount of times my dad has verbally said, I love you, but I have lost track of all the times he said, what do you want from Costco?
Oh yeah.
Or lost track of all the times he would sit with me at the end of dinner and peel my clementines in one long roll and
Mm.
hand me a segment, and each segment felt like a love letter. So that's how our parents show love. These bids for connection are through action.
Mm. That is so powerful. And I love that imagery, by the way. I love the way you write. Like, you have such a beautiful way of expressing these little moments. And it's true. I do think that we do recognize that. I'm curious a little bit because you mentioned that immigration plays a role. I wonder, though, if there are people in Asia from where it is that we might be from or our ancestors were from who also experience this. Does culture also play a role here?
I think so. So I identify as a Chinese Filipino American woman, but the culture that I grew up with is predominantly Filipino. And
Hmm.
oh, that we see similar kinds of patterns of stress and trauma and things like scarcity mindsets and crab mentalities in the Philippines. It's not distinct to Filipino Americans or Asian Americans. This exists in Asian countries too. This sort of
Hmm.
expectation that our worth is based on the objective, tangible outcomes of success that
Hmm.
we acquire. So we're seeing this kind of measurement of value based on tangible outcomes. Also, we're seeing general cultural trends where we still have a lot of stigma around help seeking. We have a lot of stigma around mental health topics in general.
Hmm.
And if you think about traditional, especially East Asian ideas about what it looks like to be strong, a lot of it is
Hmm.
emotional control. A lot of it is not giving in to emotions or being strong enough to overcome or override those emotions and not being very vulnerable.
Hmm. The word that came up to me when you're talking about vulnerability is that vulnerability in my upbringing has always been seen as weakness.
Mhm.
Like, even saying that just now, I'm like, ooh, like I
Mm.
felt that because I think there is in my upbringing, in my environment, like there's nothing worse than being seen as weak.
Yeah.
So help me connect it. Is vulnerability a form of weakness? Especially in the cultures that we're from, because I think that is the idea is that we put on a face, right? We have to seem strong. And sometimes seeming strong is as important as being strong. Is vulnerability weakness?
I don't think so. And I think that it's important to contextualize this a little bit, right?
Okay.
So vulnerability is the extent to which we feel safe and comfortable to be our truly authentic self in a variety of spaces.
Hmm.
So in some situations, to be our authentic self is not always a good fit. Maybe
Hmm.
it would position us in ways that would lead to discrimination or to aversion or to other unhelpful sort of outcomes. But then
Hmm.
in other places with other relationships, that vulnerability is a strength. Our
Hmm.
ability to be courageous and sit with the possibility that folks might not accept us, might not be willing to hold space for us. So there's a time and a place for vulnerability, remembering that
Hmm.
this will likely evolve across contexts and
Hmm.
situations and also in relationships.
So how do we this is gonna sound a little bit like an ironic question, but how do we know when to be vulnerable and when not to be?
Hmm. I wonder whether people, this is one of those internal senses, right? I
Ooh,
think
this is good.
that
Okay.
I think that it's gonna depend per person. It's gonna depend on someone's readiness to sit with the outcome of vulnerability, because with vulnerability comes the potential for rejection.
Mm,
To what
totally.
extent has that person built up the coping strategies, the community of support to help them bolster the outcome if rejection is the case?
Mhm.
All of those things are in place, then I would invite vulnerability because they have the ability to perhaps navigate rejection. But if we're early on in our healing journey and we're still learning to have these conversations, set healthy boundaries, ask for what we want, need, and desire, and then also to mitigate the impact of rejection, then we need to cultivate those first before dipping our toes in the vulnerability water. But I think vulnerability exists on a spectrum.
Mm, I like that. The mention that we have to be discerning in the moment to moment whether or not the consequences are what it is that we want.
Hmm.
And that makes a lot of sense. So what I'm just gonna come back to the book here because we're talking about patterns that remain, right? Like I love talking about patterns because that's the way I think that we do everything is like we look at patterns. I've personally have identified a lot of my own patterns in my own coaching practice. I've seen a lot of patterns that show up. When you talk about patterns, what are the kind of the key patterns that you see as being the most common or the ones that you see the most in your clients?
Yeah. So the ones that I often see are things around having to work twice as hard to get half as far. And that was a very specific message that I heard growing up, but that I know a lot of individuals who identify as Black, Brown, Asian, people of color also
Mhm,
sort of sense of having to work twice as hard to get half as far as our white colleagues.
mhm.
Other one that I hear is around not rocking the boat and just being grateful for the opportunity.
Oh, God. Yeah. Sorry, I apologize for how large my eye roll was, but
Yeah,
100%, yes. How often have we heard this? Just be grateful. Just be
yeah,
grateful. Yeah,
absolutely.
stop complaining.
Stop complaining. Just be glad that you got the opportunity and take on every opportunity that comes up because
Yeah.
another one might not. And someone else will succeed and you'll fall behind.
Yeah.
So
The
those are
story that, like, any kind of win that you've gotten is not necessarily earned or deserved, but rather is some kind of a blessing bestowed upon you by the masses, right? Like, that internalization, ugh, that's a problem.
it is. And think about the implications of that for things like imposter syndrome, this feeling of I'm only here because I'm the token Asian or I somehow stumbled onto this accomplishment or role or opportunity.
Mhm.
Terribly invalidating.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So that first one you were talking about with this, I work twice as hard to get half as far, or I feel like my work isn't being valued based on my contributions. When we take a look at it from the patterns context, and the first question I always come up with, is this a systemic problem? Is this a white people need to do better problem, or is there something else behind it?
Around the working twice as hard to get half as far. I think it's a combination of sort
Mhm.
of this is such a good question. I never thought about this. Right. I think it's a combination of intra-ethnic or intra-group expectations. So we go into this already measuring our value independent of ourself, which we already inherently have value. We go into this thinking, I'm only good enough when.
Oh.
And then we have a system that is still grounded in whiteness as the norm and white supremacy as the room tone that positions non white individuals from places where their American identity is secondary. So, as Asian Americans, we're always having to position ourselves in ways that solidify our American identity. But think
Hmm.
about COVID-19. We had to re-justify why we deserve to be in this country. Our
Mhm.
Asianness was seen as the primary identity before the American part of our identity. We have
Mm.
both parts coming at it simultaneously.
Mhm. Isn't it funny that the way that those 2 words, Asian American, seems to switch depending on the conveniences of the context, right? Like, when, like, it's, like, a model minority discussion or debate exactly, right? Like, when it's like, "Oh, no, like, there's nothing wrong with you. Everything is fine. Stop complaining," then it's, "We all see you as American. We don't see you as color." But then as soon as there is an issue, that Asian part comes up real big and real loud.
Absolutely. And yeah, I've seen these conversations around model minorities, and I'm wondering if folks are understanding the history of from where that came.
Do you wanna share a little bit more on that?
Sure. So the model minority myth originally derived out of like the 1960s when we saw a lot of anti Black oppression. And folks from the Black community were saying, hey, there is some real problems with the system here. We're seeing a lot of racism.
Mhm.
white folks, specifically white supremacists, were saying, I don't think that's true. Look at these model minorities. Look at these Asians who've somehow been able to succeed. And it's because they're succeeding and they're non white, they're minorities. That just must mean that you are not doing the work. You need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But this doesn't take into account that not everyone has boots and not everyone has bootstraps. And positioning Asians as model minorities ends up creating a false dichotomy. If you weren't a model minority, you became a problem minority. If you
Oh,
weren't Asian and you were Latina or Black or any other kind of minority, you were a problem minority. And Asians as a model minority has been used as a triangulation strategy to invalidate the presence of anti Black sentiments.
okay. I love the way you put that. That is so well stated that when you are the model minority, by definition, anytime that you are speaking up, anytime that you are pointing out issues, especially given the fact that there's such a complex term, or using the word Asian American, it is a complex as hell term. A lot of people don't know this, but Asian American, the term Asian American is in of itself a political term because prior to the 1960s, there was no Asian American. There was Chinese American, Japanese, Filipino, etc. And then actually at the time, for the most part, people just used the term Oriental.
Yes.
So it wasn't until in the 1960, Yuji Ichioka, I hope I'm not butchering that in memory, who was an activist at the time, came up with the term Asian American as a way to bring people together, to support, to align with other racial justice movements, including Black Americans. And that was a huge shift. So it's so interesting that Asian Americans get used by the model minority myth as a way to put down other people. When in fact, even just as a grouping, this was created as a collective bargaining chip.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really complex and nuanced. And I'm so glad that you're giving voice to it because a lot of folks probably don't know the history of it. So I'm really glad you shared that too.
This is the work that we're going to do, right? I want to come back again to this, to the patterns that you talked about. Another point that you talked about is the idea of imposter syndrome. I love discussing imposter syndrome because I like to call imposter syndrome like the friend I have who's in the room that I'm always trying to negotiate with because that part of me is just, oh, hey, how's it going? He's right there right now in my seat. Um, because he comes up very often. My question is, can we explore imposter syndrome in the context of Asian Americans or Asians? Like, why does that come up more prominently compared to those of other groups?
Sometimes I wonder whether it does.
Okay,
I think that imposter syndrome exists across all communities.
totally.
And the more intersecting, historically marginalized identity someone holds, the more likely they are to have stronger imposter syndrome. So you have an Asian person, okay? Imposter syndrome. But imagine you have an Asian woman, more propensity for imposter syndrome. Now, an Asian queer woman, greater propensity. An Asian
Mhm.
queer trans woman, even more propensity. So, with every layer of historically marginalized identity, you have another script where folks have a history where their identity has been discounted and invalidated and told, that's not good enough. You're not good enough. Then you have the increased sort of tokenization mentality that becomes layered with every compounding identity.
Wow, that's powerful. That's a good point. We're all experiencing imposter syndrome in one way or the other, but the more is the word intersectional the right term? I like the way you put it, compounded identities, the more ways that we have been seen as the other, the more context in which we have been seen as different from quote unquote the norm, of course we're going to feel like an imposter. I still remember that it's such a funny thing. We're talking about imposter syndrome. There's a study I remember that does actually identify that Asian American students have experienced a higher rate of imposter syndrome compared to others. And by definition, when you think about the two terms we just talked about, model minority and imposter syndrome, they in some ways philosophically go linked, right? Model minority, by definition, is that you are a minority. You are different. You are the other, but you're the good other. If you're the good other, that suggests that there's normalcy. Normalcy is good. So you are as good as the others can be. You are as close to normal as the others. We're always almost there. We're almost good, and that's the thing I feel like, we're always struggling with is that if the goal of assimilation, I'm curious to hear if you agree with this, is that if the goal of assimilation being here is we are like the dominant, like we fit in and are accepted and are seen as, I don't want to necessarily make it about race, but the white people, then that means that we won. Like we did it. Won.
In
We did it right. Assimilation, like we've assimilated. We've been accepted as everyone else is.
Yeah. But here's what's interesting about assimilation is we don't get to decide when we fit in. We don't get to decide when we're accepted.
Right.
So we might do all the things that we think is going to give us white proximity and access to resources and cultural capital, but we're not the ones that get to decide when we're accepted. That's an objective outside label. And so for someone like me, who's very strongly positioned in her Asian identity, my goal is not to assimilate. My goal is to be bicultural. My goal
Mhm,
is able to hold true my values, my beliefs, my heritage, my dress, all
mhm,
the things that make me Asian, and also hold that in balance with American ideals, values, dress, identities. So
mm,
we have this sort of spectrum of assimilation. On one hand, you have folks who are not assimilated. These are folks who maybe don't have English fluency. They really hold true to Asian language, culture. My mom, bless her, love her. Please don't listen to this part of the podcast. She like only has Asian friends. She only eats Asian food. She has the same kind of like insular community.
Oh,
And
dude. Yeah,
yikes,
I can relate, yeah. Keep going.
only watches the Filipino channel. And then you have folks like who identify as bananas or Twinkies. They say yellow on the outside, white on the inside. They're fully
Mhm,
assimilated. These are folks who truly have relegated and relinquished their Asian identity to
mhm,
be, in all intents and purposes, white. Now,
mhm,
neither of these ends of the spectrum end up having really good mental health because
mm,
they aren't able to navigate or code switch based on the context and the community and the situation they face. The
mhm,
folks that have the best mental health and relationships tend to be somewhere in the middle, that bicultural place where they're
mhm,
not fully assimilated because they know who they are. And having a strong ethnic identity is one of the strongest protective factors for Asian American community members.
mm,
So, having a strong sense of who we are, what we value, and what's important to us, and being able to still navigate society, I think I wonder if that might be the goal to increase mental health in Asian American communities.
mm. So, assimilation is a complex idea. I think that's a big takeaway here,
Mhm.
and that a lot of times when I was growing up, this was always seen as that's what the goal is. We're trying to be in this melting pot. We're trying to be in this big gray soup that accompanies all the various colors and races. That's part of it. But yeah, so what defines this kind of the difference between assimilated bananas and bicultural, where like we're proud and we take ownership of both the parts or multiple parts?
Good question, John Wang. I
An A.
a sound like you. Big Asian class, big Asian energy class,
Heck
101,
yeah. Yep.
killing it. I think that the characteristic trait of assimilated folks
Mhm.
is shame and internalized racism. It is the
Mm.
belief that the best values are the ones held by the majority or whiteness. It's
Mhm.
white values and norms at the expense of our perhaps Asian collectivistic ideals. So you
Mm.
have the most assimilated levels internalize racism and belief that who I am isn't good enough. And my
Mhm.
identity is one that I feel shame around.
Hmm.
Some
Wow. I love
people.
that. That's an Instagram quote right there. Okay. There was something that in your book that I really loved, and it was talking about because I think that this is something many people can probably relate to. It's the experience of trying to connect with our parents. And I think in your book, there's a part that was called Nako, you have become too American.
Mhm.
Can you share a little bit about that experience, that story?
Yeah. So, nako is Tagalog for "Oh, no." And so I was someone who I grew up in America, but I was born in the Philippines. I moved here when I was 18 months old. And so my entire childhood growing up, my mom always would say, "Nako, talaga, you've become too American. You've forgotten where you came from."
Mhm.
This sense of I had no longer been a Filipina, and now I'm too white. I'm wearing Abercrombie& and Fitch, I'm wearing
Mhm.
makeup, I'm straightening my hair, I'm doing all of these things that Filipinos don't do.
Right.
And so we tend to see this kind of conflict often in immigrant families where the child is working toward assimilating their identity and their parents want that because our parents came to the country thinking if my child is assimilated, they won't face discrimination. That's why
Mhm.
many of us didn't learn the language. That's why many
Mm.
parents didn't teach us Filipino, Chinese, Tagalog, Ilocano, any kind of language because our parents thought if they learn the language, they'll face discrimination. So our parents want to protect us. But then when we do move closer toward assimilation, they think that we've forgotten our roots. And you'll see this
Mm.
conflict in immigrant families where the children are trying to navigate bicultural identities, but the parents think that we've forgotten where we've come from.
Of course. It's the irony thing, right? Like, they work so hard, they sacrifice so much to bring us to this new place, but in doing so, they also must feel this sense of threat. What if I took away something that was their birthright, their connection to their culture and their heritage? And I think that's a big one. Growing up, my mom's way of dealing with that was very much trying to make sure that we learned Chinese to the point that there wasn't a Chinese teacher when we first moved here. And my mom literally started her own Chinese school and forced me to go through like 10. I appreciate your approval of it, but my 10-year-old self would have probably felt differently about it. But we went through several years of that, and now I am quite proud that I'm able to converse and read and write Mandarin, which was my native tongue.
That's
But
amazing.
yeah, and in that regard, like, I could communicate with them and understand them and read the books that they read when they were growing up. So I think that preservation of cultural heritage is always such a big one.
Absolutely. We see so much mourning around culture when folks don't feel connected to language or history, or folks aren't able to read the books that their parents read. And we see this sort of not enoughness script that comes up. Folks who think, I'm not Asian enough, I'm not Filipino, I'm not Chinese enough, I'm not Korean enough because I can't cook the food, I can't read the language, I can't speak the language. And we see this sort of mourning for the kind of cultural richness that folks wish they had that
Mhm.
they lost at the expense of our parents' wishes for assimilation.
Absolutely. I was at a dinner a couple of days ago when, I was at this event, and one of the people in my group, she asked she looked over to me, and she was talking about some other unrelated thing. She says, "So what kind of Asian are you?" And without thinking deeply about the question, the first response that I get is, "Not a very good one." And I was like, I'm like, I think I'm like a C plus Asian, like maybe a B minus Asian. Cause, and in my mind, I'm like going off and trying to explain this. I'm like, I don't practice all the cultural stuff. Like, I don't do all the rich, like the stuff from my culture. I don't know it very well. Like I do. I married a white partner. Like, I'm like an okay-ish Asian. And then she paused and a little bit sheepishly. She just, I just meant like, where are you from? Like, I didn't want to be so direct. I
Oh,
don't know how
my God.
when he's in person. But it was an interesting moment. I was just like, "Yeah, I'm like an okay-ish Asian. I'm like, I'm a good enough Asian."
I'm
Oh
interested
my gosh.
that you went like values based instead of ethnicity. I think that speaks to your like why you are so powerful and have such impact is that you're always heart focused, you're value
Mm.
based in the approach you have to these questions. 'Cause I don't know that most folks would have responded that way. It really speaks to your incredible character.
Oh, thank you so much. Man, I can see why it is that you're such a good therapist. I am feeling way better after this interview. Okay, so coming back, speaking of therapy, because this is a big part of our discussion in this book, is probably, I'm guessing, your experience with your work, right? What would you say is the maybe not the most prominent or even the most common, but what do you think is one of the struggles that speaks most to the heart of the people, the Asian Americans who come to seek you out?
Oh, gosh. It's questions around how do I cultivate the life that I want for myself while honoring my parents' wishes for me?
Oh, I'm just going to give that space to land because I felt that one. Okay. Tell me more.
It's the how do I balance the expectations for self actualization, which
Hmm.
is an individualistic Western idea is about wellness, right? So everyone's
Yeah.
about Maslow's hierarchy,
Yeah.
and the bottom is survival, at the top is self actualization. But self actualization is the goal that someone can make the decisions that they want to make that align with their values as a person. Great. But that in and of itself already invalidates the fact that many Asians are collectivistic. So the right decision for us often isn't the one that's right for us as a person, but what's right for our community and our family
Right.
of origin. So I'll never forget a client I once had. At the time, this was over a decade ago, a Korean American woman in her early 20s. And she comes to me with great distress. She says, Stacey, I found the love of my life. He is a musician and I want to move in with him. We've been dating for 8 months. I think he's the guy. And I don't know what to do.
Hmm.
I just held space. And she says later on that she has been to 3 other therapists, and all of them said, "Just move in. You love this
Hmm.
guy. You have a future with him, just move in." She said,
Hmm.
"Something about that didn't feel right."
Yeah.
Gonna tell me more, and what came out, as you can imagine, is that her Korean mom had given her messages her entire life that you
Hmm.
don't move in with someone until you're married.
Hmm.
And you move in with someone ideally who shares your ethnic identity. So
Hmm.
there are pieces around my mom wants me to marry a Korean man, and my mom doesn't want me to cohabitate with a partner until we're married. Therapists were saying, just move in. It was so invalidating
Yeah.
to her ethnic identity. And the question was, how do we hold space for the values you have and then also the values that you're carrying from your cultural community? That's the challenges.
So, how do we hold that? What was the response? Because I think that is the question. I think that you're right. This speaks so deeply to so many of our experiences. And my parents wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. I think my
Mhm.
mom specifically said you could be anything that ends with the word is Chinese word is Mandarin word is shi, which is basically like master of. You got to go to do your master's in this. And I was like, "What about teacher?" And she's, "The one thing you can't be is teacher." And then guess what I became. So I that was my first real major, like, I started teaching. But I think this is a question. So how does one, maybe that client of yours, reconcile that? The desires of our individual identity, especially one that we grew up in Western culture, versus the collectivist.
Yeah, we're getting deep. We're really jamming here. I focus on values-based work. So
Mhm,
I want to know what are her values? What at the end of
mhm,
the day are the things that drive her, pull her, that are going to inform her decision in the ways that are going to help her feel most connected.
mhm,
With any person who is curious about which decision to make or which path to pursue, my favorite question to ask them is this: what do you hope to experience? Because if we
right,
can target the experience or the feeling that folks want to pursue, it becomes much easier to reverse engineer
mm,
what path will be. So for this particular client, she said, what I want to experience is connection. She
mhm,
wanted to feel close to her partner. She thought that cohabitating with him was the way to feel close, but
mhm,
she also wanted to maintain closeness with her mother.
mhm,
For this particular client, if that's what she wanted to experience, the way we worked backward around that was we had a conversation with the client around how do we negotiate difficult dialogues with our partner and say, is this a deal breaker?
Mhm.
Right now, in my identity, in my journey, preserving the relationship with my mom is something that I really value. And how do I maintain that without potentially compromising our goals, our shared relationship? And in this particular case, the partner was really gracious and said, I'm prepared to wait for you. I can't wait to meet your mom. Let's find ways to make it work. And so it was a lot of practice around difficult dialogues and boundary setting. And we did a lot of work too around preparing for the potential of rejection because maybe that talk wasn't going to have the ideal outcome that she was hoping for. Luckily, it did.
But what if it didn't? I'm curious about that part because it sounds like that partner was understanding, but I've also heard of cases where the parents just aren't that willing to be that flexible, or the partner and we're all forced to choose between either satisfying what our parents want or possibly giving up on the love of our lives. That's a big one to hold on to.
That is a big one to hold on to. And oftentimes it doesn't need to come to an ultimatum.
Mm,
Sometimes with time, we're able to continue having those conversations and have folks flex what those boundaries look like. The other question that I have folks ask, and especially the parents, when parents are presenting as rigid and they say, this is the only way, you have to become a master of something, or you have to marry someone with a shared cultural identity. Anytime we meet someone that presents with this rigid belief system, it has to be this way.
mhm,
Third question to ask is, what are you afraid is going to happen?
mm,
Because if you ask someone, what are you afraid is going to happen? Then you're able to address that specific concern instead of making assumptions around what we think might
mm,
actually be the underlying reason. So maybe in this situation, mom says, I'm afraid you're going to move in with him and you're not going to be able to take care of me and your father when we get older. Okay,
mm.
let's
Yeah.
address that.
Mhm,
Let's find ways to make sure that you feel connected and safe and secure. And let's set up times where I check in regularly, ensure you have what you need to feel safe and protected, and that you feel that I'm caring for you and my dad.
mhm,
So when you understand what are you afraid is going to happen, we're better able to troubleshoot and find ways to negotiate a shared understanding of the outcome we can both commit to.
mm, mm. I love that. I just want to confirm, is this one of the ways that one of the things you talk about in the book is the idea of the meta message? And just to contextualize, I just want to see, is this a meta message question?
Yes, I
Yeah.
think so.
So just to contextualize for those who have never heard of the term meta message, what's the message behind the message, right? There's the thing that we say, that's the literal thing that we say. But most of the time when we're communicating, we're not literally saying what we're saying. We are saying what's underneath it. And by the way, I have a quote here I want to share from the book that I'm like, this landed so hard for me that I have to put it in the podcast so anyone listening could know it and then they could go in the book and check it out. But it sounds like essentially their question is when somebody says, when your parent is saying, "Look, I'm not comfortable with you marrying, sorry, with moving with your partner without it." The meta message might be, "I want to make sure that you know this is the right person before you make such a big move, because in my background, in my culture, moving in with someone is a very large statement, not just personally but also socially." It could also be because I don't want people to view my family this way, which might reflect poorly on me as a parent, which is a
Mhm.
tougher meta message and maybe not one that parents are quite as willing to admit at first glance. Or maybe even the meta message might just be because I'm not ready to lose you yet. And I feel like if you were to move in with somebody else, then I might lose my daughter. I might
Mm,
lose a connection. I might no longer have that connection that we share. And I think those are all really complex questions that can get brought up.
absolutely. Those are beautiful examples of meta messages that might have been present when that client's mom said, I'm not comfortable with this.
Yeah. Okay. I want to share this. All right. So this is the quote. Because when I came across this, I was just like, this is amazing. All right. This is from one in this is from your book, Patterns That Remain, and it spoke to me because of my own personal experience. And this quote goes, when our Asian American parents say, you have to work hard to become successful, or that career choice is not good enough, you should become a doctor instead, or you earn an A, why not an A plus? All things that I probably heard in my childhood. Here's the meta message our parents seek to communicate. I struggled for a long time and I don't want that life for you. As a result, I encourage you to work hard and achieve career success so you can be happy, healthy, safe, and successful. Yet, the message that we tend to internalize is my parents cannot accept me for who I am, therefore, I am not good enough. Or my accomplishments always seem to fall short, so therefore, I am unworthy of love. Or even if I do not succeed academically or occupationally or reach the milestones my parents have set for me, then I will be a disappointment. When I read through that, I think my heart stopped because it's one of those things that is so clear. And I can imagine how many people have sat through conversations that felt so heartbreaking, or they did not feel like they could be seen or heard or recognized by the people that they love most in the world. And yet, how many of those conversations ended up being, I think my only solution is to disconnect, either emotionally or physically. So I'm curious, for somebody who might be in that position, who recognizes or in the moment sees that there's a meta message mismatch or wonders that, how do they overcome that internalized belief of my parents can't accept me, so therefore I'm not good enough? My accomplishments aren't enough, so therefore I'm unworthy. How do we reprogram that?
Yeah. Compassion.
Oh,
Compassion little things. I
mm,
think lead with compassion, life gets a little bit kinder for ourselves, for our parents, for the other folks that we are in relationship with. But holding compassion for ourselves, for the ways in which we've communicated what our parents have meant, even if it's not always true. And then compassion for our parents for raising us and loving us in the best way that they knew how. So, the other part of it is once we're able to understand why it is that our parents don't always communicate clearly and we have to unpack the meta messages, we get to have these conversations with them and be curious around, say more about what you're afraid of. Where's that
right.
coming from? What would it look like if I actually did become a teacher?
I'm just trying to think of how that last one is going to land. But you're
Well,
absolutely right. Yeah,
let's
go ahead.
take all the way through. If you told your mom, "Hey, mom, like I'm going to be a teacher." She
Yeah.
said, "What?"
Okay. I'm gonna try to remember this actual conversation. I think that for her, I don't remember the exact conversation. I think for her, by the time that I brought it to her main concern is, do you know what you're doing? Do you have a
Mhm,
plan? And
mhm,
I think it is based around the idea, the fear that she was holding on to is, are you going to be successful? Are you
abs
going to be able to take care of yourself? Are you going to be someone we need to worry about in terms of like financials or social standing? And
yeah,
for me, I think by then I had some degree of confidence and I was building my own. I wasn't teaching in the system, but rather I was teaching privately. So I had some ideas of how I was going to develop. So I was able to bring that to her and she understood. And also it helps that my sister had already chosen the same path before me. So she was used to it.
absolutely.
My
But what I'm hearing you say, John, is that these messages that we internalize, we hear as not accepting us, they come
Mhm.
from places of concern. They come
Hmm.
from places of, I want to make sure that my children are happy, healthy, safe, and successful. And in my mind, this is a different path than I had anticipated for them. So, with that new path, I'm not prepared to understand the outcome. And now I'm worried. Now I'm concerned they might not be able to keep themselves safe and fed and happy and healthy and whole. So, this is the best way that I know. Doctor,
Hmm.
lawyer, engineer, STEM field. This is what feels safe and comfortable. And everything else feels really scary. I don't want that for my kid.
Or for ourselves. I think that's the hard part, at least for me, has been recognizing, oh, is that my voice or my parents' voice? And if it's my voice, is it something I genuinely need to be aware of, to be worried for, or is it an imagined fear that I am confronting in the moment?
Oh, that's powerful. The community of voices, this sort of internal dialogue, the messages that we tell ourselves throughout the
Mm,
day. How many of those are ours? And how many of those are internalized from family systems, friends, peers, media, religious communities? And
mhm,
to what extent are those messages working for us?
mhm. Absolutely. Amazing. There's some really I love how we navigated. There's so many different parts that we gotta go play around in. Before we close off, I'm curious, is there any final thoughts or messages that you feel like if you got a chance to tell someone, I wouldn't even say our audience, but if you had a chance to go back in time and tell yourself from a few years ago, if you could, like, travel back in time, what would one piece of message would you like to share with them?
Hmm. I could travel back in time and tell little Stacy something. It
Mhm.
would be that you are worthy of love and connection and belonging, and you are already good enough as you are.
Mm, gosh. I think we all needed to hear that. I
Mhm.
certainly felt like what oh, I'm just gonna take a moment and let that land. That's beautiful. Is there anything else you wanna cover before we send this episode off?
No, I feel good. I could talk to you for 5 hours. This was a lot of fun. I can't believe that the time flew by the way it did.
I know. I like, there's so many different questions that I had written down that I still want to go to, but I actually am really glad that we got to land on some of the topics that we did. I really am glad that we got to hit on the meta message topic. That one was huge. I would have loved to ask you more about adult attachment. I would have loved to ask.
Is it too late? Let's
No,
get
let's
into
jump in. Yeah, let's jump in. I've got another hour, so but I don't wanna impose, but we can
No,
take as
not at
much time
all.
as you want, so
Yes,
alright,
attachment
so
is everything. Once you understand attachment, you will never listen to music the same way because you'll realize that every different musical artist has a different attachment style. And folks who are saying things like, don't leave me, where are you? What are you doing? Like, that's incredibly anxious attachment style. And folks who are saying, like, I don't want to lose my independence and you want too much from me. I'm going to that I want. That's very clearly avoid an attachment. And you can watch someone like Taylor Swift move through waves of attachment based on partner selection. Incredible. The
we
era of
are
attachment.
never, ever getting back to you. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's dive in. For those audience members who have never heard of attachment styles or have not experienced it, what's a 30-second top level explanation?
Ooh, okay. So attachment styles, although they often originate from the kind of attachment style we had with our parent as an infant or a child, we have these adult attachment styles, and they typically relate to the way that we understand relationships and then also respond in times of stress and
Mhm,
separate. The ideal attachment style is secure. This is someone who feels safe and connected with their partner. They're able to have moments where they withdraw and return. And I typically tend to have the ability to set flexible boundaries and engage in empathic communication.
mhm,
And then you have insecure attachment styles. On one hand, you have anxious attachment. On the other hand, you have avoid. You also have disorganized, which is the amped up level of both. These are folks who have an extremely hypervigilant and easily activated attachment system. These are folks who are extremely keen and aware of patterns and tend to place meaning on things that feel different. So maybe, John, when I text you, I know you normally text back pretty quickly, but now I've texted you, you've left me on red and it's been 5 minutes. That's new.
mm,
Something's on here. You left me on red, but now it's been 2 hours. Now I'm hyper focused. My anchor attachment is firing on all
mhm.
cylinders,
Are they
and I'm
mad at me?
mad at me.
Did I do
Angry.
something? Did I say something? For me,
Yes.
I'm like, should I unsend that message?
Should I edit this in some way? And I'm rereading again and again. What did I say to trigger my partner to withdraw?
Oof.
Engage in these protest behaviors. This, are you
Mm,
mad at me? Okay, what's wrong?
yeah.
These checking behaviors, checking my phone. It's been 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Where are they?
Yeah.
And then you have the avoidant attachments, folks who really value autonomy and independence. And when folks get too close, they worry, oh, my independence, my autonomy is now compromised. Someone needs me. And
Mhm.
early on, that the only person that I can rely on is myself. So
Mhm.
you roll. And what tends to be really tricky is you see the anxious person and the avoidant person tend to pair up. And it
Mhm.
becomes incredibly intoxicating type of relationship dynamic where the avoidant person withdraws and then the anxious person pursues. And you have this kind of cat and mouse. Every time they come together, the dopamine fires because it feels really good. But inevitably, it's the cycle of the anxious person trying to convince the avoidant of their worth and the avoidant person feeling the tension and then the release and then the tension and then the release. And
Mm.
the sex is often really good, but the communication.
That is I think you just described, like, at least a few of my past relationships right there.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something really satisfying about being able to finally convince someone of your worth.
Oh,
And then, yeah, like the dopamine fires
yeah.
up.
Yeah. So how do we know when we're in that kind of attachment, anxious avoidant attachment patterns in our relationships? Aside from when we get crazy when people don't text us back, which
Oof. It's our
I
ability.
suck at texting people back, so I'm sure I've tripped with people in the last 3 days. I'm terrible at texting.
If someone is securely attached, they have this sort of object permanence and they realize that even when you're away from me, our connection is sustainable, our connection is safe, our connection is
Mhm.
strong. I might check in to say, hey, are you okay? But part of it is being able to communicate, hey, I haven't heard back from you for 3 hours. I just wanted to check in and make sure that everything is okay.
Mhm.
And when you tell me that you have meetings all afternoon, I really value that because then I can anticipate your absence and I can be ready to receive you upon returns. Training our partners is being able to communicate our wants, needs, and desires to our partners, especially around communication and vulnerability.
Hmm. So being very direct in our communication styles is a way to break through those patterns. Is there a way for us to identify when, because I'm sure that for many of us, we know our own patterns in some way or the other. I'm not saying that everyone does, but I definitely can say there's been times where I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I have that pattern," but then I don't always know to solve it, or I don't know how to resolve it. So if we're in that experience when we're seeing that pattern show up a lot in our lives, where we're, like, getting mad at people for things they didn't do, or being like, "Why didn't you text me? Why do you hate me? Why do you always do this?" And all those kinda little messages start coming out. How do we address it internally, aside from calling up Stacey to book a quick session to help us work through it?
So I love this sort of stop, drop, and roll method that I have in the book, but essentially do nothing. Once you realize, ooh,
Ooh.
let me text this person and say, are you okay? What's wrong? Are you mad at me? What's going on here? Just stop. Stop whatever it is that you're about to do. Put the phone down. Don't creep on their ex. Don't do the things that you want to do. Don't give in to that voice that says you're not good enough or trying to break up with you. Just stop.
Mhm.
And then this sort of rolling around in the reflection and asking yourself, what is it that you want? And
Mm,
the securely attached relationship. So then
mm,
ask yourself, is what I'm about to do going to help me get to what I want? And if it's not, do something else. Distract yourself, do something for you that's going to help you feel more connected to yourself. Taking a
mm,
walk, on a run, journaling, petting your puppy, like fur therapy is really great, but doing something to reconnect to yourself instead of focusing outward and using that person's validation as evidence of your inherent value because you're already good enough. You don't need that person's validation.
ooh, I think you nailed it at the very ending right there, isn't it? Because it is true. It's not really that we're worried about how they view us. It's that the way that they view us make us feel better about who we are. We can't give ourselves that validation.
Yeah, totally. And the limerence that often comes up, so the limerence refers to you just got married, but remember when you first dated? When we're first dating someone new,
Yeah.
for some folks who have maybe anxious attachment tendencies, we tend to put this person on a pedestal and we can't stop thinking about them. We obsess
Mm,
about the best thing in the whole world. and we start to attribute our value based on their ability to validate us. It's
Mhm.
interesting. It's not actually the person that we're attracted to, it's the part of who we are that gets unlocked in that person's presence that we enjoy.
I felt that last part. Can I get you just to repeat that? Because I
Yeah.
feel like there's something really powerful at the core of that.
Mhm. So when we meet someone new,
Mhm.
and now we feel more adventurous. We
Mhm.
feel more sexually open. We feel
Mhm.
spontaneous. We feel
Mhm.
more vulnerable. We think, this person makes me better. But
Mm.
really, that person just gives us permission to unlock the pieces of ourself that have become dormant for some time.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's not the person, but what we believe the person unlocks in us that we're attracted to.
It's the permission.
Permission. They
That's the word I was trying to connect with. Yes, absolutely. Is that when we get to experience it with the people around us, they allow us to be able to say, okay, this is where I've always been, but I haven't given myself the permission to access.
Yeah. And you think about for Asian Americans, many of us over our lifetime, we
Mhm.
stop self permission. We stop
Mhm.
permission to rock the boat, meet
Mhm.
set boundaries, not be so much of a people pleaser. We become this like fragmented part of ourself that is digestible and acceptable and approved of by people in society and educational settings, by past partners. We find a way to fit the mold of everyone else around us. So we have a partner that wholeheartedly loves us, all of us, then that becomes the role model for
Mhm.
the fact that we can love ourselves.
Mhm.
They love the fact that we are loud and assertive, but that's not a part that we felt connected with.
Mhm.
Having someone role model that part of us is lovable gives us permission to love that part of ourselves and it integrate into a whole person.
I freaking love this so much. I want to put it on a cake and eat it because it's so good. That's 100% the way. So the question I have then is knowing this, how do we, as a continued practice, give ourselves the love and the permission or the acceptance or the worthiness? Because I think that's always the deeper question that
Mhm.
we really want, that we seek so much from the people around us.
Mhm. There is nothing that our partner, let me think about this, how to say this. The qualities that we often identify
Mhm.
as core pieces in our ideal partner are the qualities that we most want to experience ourselves. So we might make a list and say, I want a partner that's trustworthy. What we really want is to learn to trust ourselves.
Oh, that is good.
We might say, I want a partner that communicates with me. What we
Mhm.
really want is the ability to communicate with ourselves and to trust
Mhm.
to communicate with others. Comes this sort of mirror work using the values that we want in our partners that we
Mhm.
believe are going to make us feel whole and connected are the ones that we are working on and have often denied ourselves.
Mhm. Isn't it so interesting that for such a long time, many of us have grown up with this belief that somebody else is there to make us whole, but
Mhm.
we were always whole to begin with. We just wanted somebody to reflect that within ourselves, that we had that permission to be whole all along.
I've got chills.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just need that. We just need that person to reflect that we are good enough, are whole as we are.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. I think that I don't know if we could top that. I'm sure we can. I'm sure if we kept going, we could find 3 more of those that dives in deeper. You know what? I'm gonna continue because I get this time with you, and I really have so many other questions. Okay.
Let's do it.
So let's just do at least one more because there's a whole discussion that we dive deeper into sorry, that you dive deeper into in your book, where you talk a little bit more about sexuality. And this is always such a tricky one because Asians are sexualized in very different like, in very different ways and very different models. And we're talking about the way that, for example, somebody who is Japanese American woman might be viewed in a sexualized context, especially in media, movies. I'm thinking about scenes from like movies like Austin Powers or very like Hollywood tropes. I'm thinking about Lucy Liu's. I'm thinking about that. All the way to what a South Asian man or an Indian man might be viewed in a sexual context will be very different. So there is a whole discussion that you have here, or you say challenging sexual stereotypes us Asian Americans can be a tricky business. I like highlighted that in red highlighter because there is such a complexity to this topic. The question I have is probably not the first time it's been asked. How do we differentiate the difference between am I being objectified?
Mhm.
Am I being fetishized? Or is this person just appreciating me because they have a preference?
Yeah. Ugh, it's so hard. I don't know that I have one answer, but I think that if we as a dating object represent, if the person is pursuing us because of our ethnic identity with no interest in getting to know us and hold space for our
Mm,
beliefs and attitudes, and it's just this sort of focus on our ethnic identity,
mm,
a red flag. If they're trying to fit us into this idea of what it means to date an Asian partner, and then they have these big responses and protests when we don't fall into that
ooh,
specific kind of expectation of how we're supposed to be,
yeah,
probably.
those social scripts. Yeah,
Mhm.
those
Yeah.
like expectations and roles. I always had the question of because this has come up before. I've had a friend, I've had more than one friend who have expressed some degree of, "I love Asian girls." And it's a tough topic because, 1, it's a it's an inherently uncomfortable subject sometimes for me.
Of
And
course.
I usually of course, 'cause how it's there's something icky about the inherent thing, but I also don't wanna be like, "Okay, it's preferences exist." And a lot of times, my question oftentimes just comes up, me like, "Well, what do you like about,
Mhm.
unquote, Asian girls?"
Good question,
And
John.
And you see this gear turn it's like when like, how do you deal with the racist who makes a racist joke and they're like, "Oh, I'm just joking," and you should the one way to shut it down is so simple, you just look at them and just being like, "I don't get it, what's the joke?" Because now they have to go, "The joke is that" "Oh," and then they'll start backtracking because it points out, like, "So what do you like about Asian girls?" Now, if what they're starting to say is, "Oh, I love how" they usually have this moment of realization,
Mhm.
as opposed to it's I don't know. I actually don't even have an answer to this. We, of course, as human beings, we have racial preferences. We have preferences of many kinds, physical preferences. We have appearance, energetic preferences, etc. But when we are diminished into a stereotype, it's really not about racial sexualized stereotyping. It's just stereotyping.
Eh,
When we are diminished to a stereotype, that inherently is the issue.
absolutely. Yeah, it's really a question of does your partner or prospective partner honor who you are as a whole complex person, or are they just focusing on your Asian identity? So I've
Yeah.
gotten messages growing up, dating past partners when folks say, "Wow, you have a lot more to say than I thought you did." Or, "Wow, I thought you were going to be more submissive than this." Or, "Wow, you don't want to have sex right now?" And I'm like, bruh, no, like it's 3 in the morning. I want to go back to sleep. So expectations around submission, around hypersexuality, around just go with the flow mentalities,
Oof.
those are met with surprise and disappointment. I'm like, okay, probably not the right person for me.
Yeah. Big red flags. Big red flags. And hopefully one that is changing. I mean, I really like to hold on to this optimistic view that with this new proliferation that we're seeing more and more Asian American content media. I recently watched, oh my gosh, hold on. I need to make sure. Passing past lives. Yeah, that's right. Past lives. Okay. I almost said passing lives. I recently watched Past Lives on a plane down to Costa Rica recently on a trip. By the way, such a good movie. Have you
I
seen
keep
it?
hearing about it. I need to watch it.
Oh, so good. So good. I like the way they handled it. So the very context behind the movie is that the film is that there's these 2 childhood friends who grew up in Korea, and one of them moved to New York and in New York, basically not remarried, sorry, found someone new and got married. And then they reconnected with her childhood mm, love,
Of
first
interest.
love, interest. Yeah. And they, in while giving away any of the ending, they take a moment and reconnect and contemplate the nature of the relationship. And it's interesting because while their culture and identity is on the forefront,
Mhm.
it really isn't about racial identity. It's really about who we are. And I think it's an interesting thing because it brought up the question for me as Asian Americans. This is a theme that we've explored a lot all throughout today's chat. We hold this duality, or maybe even more than duality, especially those of us who are from multiple different cultural backgrounds and identities. We hold multitudes. And in trying to say, this is who I am, is there, I suppose the question I'm trying to come to is this. In trying to say, this is who I am, the question is, are we simultaneously all of these? Are we one thing? Are we just a mix? Is there such an answer as what is our identity? Okay, I'm making that question way too complex. When we're talking about, I am Asian American, I am Asian Canadian, how do we find this is where it is? Okay. The core message is always about finding our authentic selves. But there's also so many different layers of expectation that we carry from our parents, from our partners, from society. Without constantly code switching, how do we own who our authentic self is at the end of the day when we're just us in front of the mirror?
Mm. How do we find who we are at the end of the day when it's just us at the end?
Yeah.
I think, I wonder if we are and will always be this evolving culmination of all the people that we've had the privilege of meeting throughout life.
No.
And so, who we are at the end of the day is going to reflect the relationships we've held and the experiences we've had and the values that we hold, and then the aspirational people we want to become, and the aspirational values we want to hold. And
Mm.
so it's going to look and feel and experientially be different every day because who we are today is not going to be who we were yesterday or even 5 minutes from now. And it's not
Mm.
who we are tomorrow. And so we get to explore and grow and marinate into whoever we are intentionally investing our time and resources into becoming.
Mm. Wow, that was such a good answer. Well done. Well,
We do it.
yeah. Oh my gosh, that was a perfect answer.
That was a hard question. I
That
was
was
like,
a hard question. I was like, when I said it, I was like, that felt like a way too big of a question. But at the same time, I was really curious to see because you took a moment, you internalized, and I saw you close your eyes and go in. I'm like, this is gonna get good.
I also was like, what's going to come out though?
Yeah. Because essentially the question that as soon as I asked it, I was essentially asking, how do you know who your authentic self is? And it's an impossible question. There is no such thing. You're right. We're constantly evolving. We contain multitudes. We are all those things. We can go into parts work and we can say that's the thing. It depends on which part is speaking. Who is the authentic? Who is the adult? Is the adult even us? If we can answer that today on this podcast, after thousands of years of philosophers asking who are we, why are we here, that would be pretty impressive. But I think you did it. I think you nailed it. We are ever changing. There is no such thing as us because in the moment that reflect, right?
Mhm.
It's like that song from Mulan. Dude, I don't remember the lyrics, right? But it's like when we look in the mirror, we are observing that which is always changing because by observing it, we are changing.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay. That was an incredible episode. Thank you once again for being on this show. I think that was, yeah, definitely one of my favorite interviews that I've done this year for sure. Without question. There's so many takeaways. I can't wait to share this with the
15
world.
of
Uh,
2025.
Heck yeah. High fives.
Boom.
Well done. Of course, please go and check out Stacey's book, Patterns That Remain. It is a deep dive that covers so many different layers about who we are as Asian children of immigrants. And it goes very deeply. I believe you can get this on Amazon as well as pretty much everywhere else you can find it. Please don't just get the book, leave a review. If it's changed you, recommend it to a friend. If it's changed you, if you hear that calling of trying to understand who you are, this is the book for you. This is called, once again, Patterns That Remain, A Guide for Healing for Asian Children of Immigrants. Thank you so much. Oh, but aside from the book, where else can they find more about you, Stacey?
Oh, yes. On Instagram, I am Dr. Stacey A. Litam. I also have a website, www.staceylitam.com.
Amazing. All right. Until next time, welcome back to Beijing Energy.